Greetings. I'm Joel Rosenthal, President of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. I'm zooming in today from my office in New York City, and I want to start by thanking everyone on this call for joining us on this special event convened for Global Ethics Day 2021. Before we begin, I just want to share a little bit of background on Global Ethics Day. Global Ethics Day takes place every year on the third Wednesday of October, and this is our 8th year running. Global Ethics Day began in 2014 as an opportunity for individuals and organizations to explore the meaning of ethics in daily life and to come together to identify the most critical issues facing society. Over the past 7 years, individuals from over 75 countries have participated in Global Ethics Day. Now, last year, during the midst of the pandemic, hundreds of activities were convened on 6 continents via socially distanced and virtual formats. And you can see the cumulative results of these efforts by visiting globalethicsday.org. I don't believe it's an exaggeration to say that this past year has been one of the most challenging ever when considered as a matter of history. We've confronted the spread of COVID-19, responded to attacks on democracy, struggled with racial injustice, and battled climate change. It's clear that humanity faces a number of global scale challenges. Our program today, On the Front Lines of Democracy, features individuals who are making a difference on one of the most urgent and concerning issues of our time, the future of democracy. The lives and work of our panelists affirm the idea that ethics matter. Through their activism, each of these individuals embodies the Carnegie Council motto, Ethics Empowered. We're very lucky to have as our moderator, Jen Williams, Deputy Editor at Foreign Policy. Jen's outstanding journalism in this area makes her uniquely suited to lead our discussion today. So Jen, thanks for your leadership. Thanks for moderating today. And I'm going to turn it over to you directly. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joel. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm going to just go ahead and introduce our brilliant panel today. If you want to read everyone's full bios, you can go to the website and check those out there. I'm just going to do a brief introduction so we can get right into the meat of the conversation here. So first we have Nathan Law. Nathan is a Hong Kong activist who is currently living in exile and based in London. Waynin Winton, thank you for joining us, Waynin. Waynin is a Burmese human rights activist and a campaigns officer at Burma Campaign UK. We have Alfredo Romero joining us today. Alfredo is a human rights lawyer and activist in Venezuela. And then we have Franek Viatorka. He's a senior advisor to Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, and a journalist from Belarus. So thank you to everyone. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. So I'd like to get started with a question that I think has been on my mind a lot, especially over the last year plus. I think many people today are experiencing a lot of feelings of helplessness regarding the state of the world. And you, our panelists today, each of you work every single day in your lives to actually do the work of defending democracy and to improve the lives of others. So I'd love to hear from you. What is your message to people like me and like I'm sure many others out there who feel like maybe there's not a lot of hope for democracy, for the future of human rights? And what actions can we ourselves maybe take to help ameliorate that feeling of helplessness? Waynin, maybe if you want to start, and then whoever else wants to hop in, please go right ahead.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think it's a very important question, but also is a very hard question as well. Yes, I mean, you know, I work on issue Burma, and given the circumstances since the coup, every day is getting harder and harder, and it's difficult to keep hope. But also, sometimes when I'm having a really hard time, I realize that it's my job and it's my duty to hold these military and hold all these bad leaders accountable. And okay, we are feeling hopeless, but also it's our job to give ourselves hope by doing these work for human rights offenders who are risking their lives on the ground. So it's more of a up and down every day, trying to keep hope and giving ourselves hope by working, doing the work that we do. So I would just keep it there for now. Yeah.
Alfredo, maybe would you like to jump in? I believe we're having a hard time having issue with the audio.
Let me see. Hello.
Oh, there you are.
Okay. Well, I'm the president of one very big NGO here in Venezuela, which is called Foro Penal. And what we do is actually trying to give hope to all these victims that we actually represent. We have here in this office where I'm talking from, we receive victims of people that are being tortured, families of people that are arbitrarily detained, and people that were arbitrarily detained for political reasons, and they come to us in order to talk and to sometimes to say thank you for what we have done about them. Actually, we have working the release of more than 12,000 victims of arbitrary detentions. I'm going to tell you that because this question fits perfectly on what I think every day. And even though, I mean, hopelessness is a very big word in the sense that who is hopelessness? Someone that is infected by coronavirus in London, for example, or someone that is in jail at this moment more than 6 years, for example, one student, Antonio, his name, without a conviction, without a trial. So it's more a psychological issue, I think. And what we do every day is try to provide these people with methods or with tools in order to go through this very bad moment, and to tell them every day, for at least from what we do, that freedom is that they will get freedom at some point. And that's what we do. We actually, and I will finish with this, we touch people. I mean, we need to touch people. We need to talk to them. We need to, actually, I'm a musician also. And we sing to people. I'm a lawyer and a musician. You will say, well, what is that relate to what we do? Yes, because we have to sing to them. We sing songs. We go to different towns around the country and we sing, and we try, and that's a way how we channel, or we create this bridge between the victim and us in order to precisely bring hope to these specific people that we attend every day.
I think that's a really fascinating point. I think art and the role of art and the arts and music, the role that can play in really connecting people, bringing people together and giving hope, I think doesn't get enough attention. So you should perform for us someday. It'd be great. Nathan, did you want to weigh in on this one?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. I'm Nathan. I think this is a very important question in Hong Kong. The situation gets worse and worse on a daily basis. On like every single day, we heard about protesters being sentenced to jail for years. We've heard political campaigners being arrested. We've heard civil society crumbling. There are lots of decades-long civil society which are backbones of the whole democratic movement are disbanded. So this is definitely a devastating situation, and I believe that everyone who is paying attention to the situation of Hong Kong would feel like the situation is dire. It's difficult to overturn it in a short-term period. So I guess like people would find it helpless when they want to reach out for help, when they are when they're in jail, when they are on the process of waiting to be trialed, when they're basically trapped in Hong Kong and they're losing the city as they used to know. Basically, the whole Chinese Communist Party is ripping the city off and trying to reform it into the way that they can have complete control in a very authoritarian stage. But I guess like there are differences in between helpless and hopeless. And I would approach hope in two ways. The one is definitely in a more faith, seen as a faith. I think as an activist, we are not entitled to lose hope. This is what we are here for. We're here for empowerment, to encourage people to resist. And we're here for bringing out the impetus and the momentum of a movement to try to change something. So to me, hope is not very analytical. It's sometimes, as a matter of faith, I believe that justice and democracy will prevail. It takes hard work. It takes a long period of dark periods before the sun rises. But I do believe that it will come. On the second would definitely be is on the people. So we've seen social events, really bad ones on a daily basis, but we can also see there are people working on the ground tirelessly with a lot of risk, doing every single little thing that they can do to help the situation. In Hong Kong, there are organizations still doing very underground work on helping inmates, helping their families. There are still organizations trying to form some kind of like groups to look into Hong Kong's future, to try to find all the cracks. And there are also people like lining up to attend court trial and send encouragement to the people who are like on the detainee box, and also like when they were being transferred to the prison, like a lot of people like running on the side of the car and try to say a hello to them and tell them, please hang on. I think these are the people who are carrying hope. They are doing everything that they could, even though in a very narrow political situation. And we will understand that when the time comes, these people would also be the force of changing the society. So I guess this is the only thing that we can approach to the situation that seems so dire, but there's possibility to change. And in an analytical level, I do feel like in a long-term future, if the world is more reckoning on what China has been doing, their authoritarian aggression and expansion, we still have a chance to safeguard our democracy and to protect it and to implement it in Hong Kong.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that segues, I think, nicely into the next question that I have. So, all of you work on the ground in, various countries where whether you're in the country that you're working for, or if you're in exile elsewhere, but you're doing the work, kind of day to day, the nitty gritty of trying to keep that hope alive and to really try to make sure that you're working toward this goal, even if it feels so dire. And so I want to know, for those of us, in the international community, for entities like the UN, the United Nations, governments, country governments, nonprofits, what role can those types of organizations play in supporting the work that you all are doing? What do you really need from these organizations? And Franak, I'd like to go with you to start on that one.
Thank you, Jennifer. I just wanted to emphasize that fight for freedom, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And of course, we can have the moments of hopelessness, but it does mean that we did not win yet, but it definitely does not mean we did lose. And definitely we should stop playing and making this self-victimization, saying all the time that dictatorships are winning. They're not. Perhaps they are prevailing for this moment being, but it's not forever. And as Nathan mentioned, in the end, democracy, democratic values will definitely win. International organizations actually created to help democratic movements like one in Belarus or in Hong Kong or other countries or Venezuela. They are not efficient at all, because at some point the structure, the character of this organization was developed in the 90s of 20th century, when the world experienced and enjoyed the rise of new democracies, the spring of democracies. And it was these organizations like United Nations, Council of Europe, OSCE, as if you speak about the regional organizations, they were supposed to solve the problems by consensus, assuming that all organizations and all countries are sharing the same values. But dozens of years passed, and we saw that many of the member states who signed up in these organizations, they share different values. And right now they're basically paralyzed by consensus-based rule, like, for example, UN Security Council, and not able to take any decision. And what we have to do right now, we have to work on redesigning them and pushing the government, pushing member states to change the rules, to change the format how they work. In the UN Security Council, for example, only informal meetings called ARIA formula meetings, they can really take decisions. Because when we take the whole UN Security Council members, they are not able to take decisions because of the veto rule. And also what we have on board right now, the big power of private sector, of tech companies. They're also like governments. The power of Facebook or Google can be compared to UN right now. And we need them, we need their active participation if we want to fight dictatorships, authoritarianism on international level. So perhaps it's a call to them to be more proactive, to be braver, and to be more consistent in supporting those who fight for democratic values and principles.
Yeah, I think that the tech point is really important. Nathan, I wonder if you wanted to get into that a little bit. I know, especially with how powerful Beijing is in controlling and cracking down on communications and pushing tech companies to censor material. I wonder, what you would like to see from tech companies in that space.
Well, for the multinational, multilateral organization, I've talked to a lot of activists that we've come up to a conclusion that they are unable to hold big countries, powerful countries like China or Russia accountable. Basically, they're not in that position of doing things like this, even though they claim that they could do it. And of course, safeguarding global democracies, I think, the most fundamental crisis of our time. We've talked about pandemic, armed proliferation, hunger, all sorts of things. But seemingly, I think for the past 2 decades, a lot of democratic countries are just too complacent about safeguarding our own democracy. They thought that at the end of the day, it will magically happen, but it won't. With those sophistication of authoritarian or even totalitarian country like China. So I think if we want to have change, if we want to have actions, we must have a change of perception. We need to see it as a crisis. We need to make global agenda, global body, global action plan, and global timetable to tackle these things like we tackle climate change. And I think the only way to do it is by uniting all these democratic countries, which they have a say, they have certain power, no matter economically or politically, and they do something together in order to address that. Of course, in part of it, big tech company do play part of it, and I think even though they are private company, but they're becoming like a public space. Everyone uses, billions of people use it. They should show us some kind of responsibility on facilitating these important agenda that would benefit a lot of people around the world. So I think we need to have a perceptual change about what we're facing. We are in such a big trouble, and we need all the democratic communities to work together to address that.
Wei-Nin, Alfredo, either of you want to weigh in on the international organizations? And it sounds so far that there's not a ton of faith in these organizations anymore. So wondering if either of you have thoughts on that.
Yes, well, I agree with Franag, what he said. However, I've been working on this for more than 20 years. And you can imagine they have talked to everyone around the world in order to get the release of one person or to try to, denounce what is going on in Venezuela. I believe that at this point, if I will say something directly and very maybe rude, international organizations, as Nathan said, they are not capable of, I would say, doing something concrete about what is going on, for example, in Venezuela at this moment. However, it doesn't mean that we don't count on them as, but it's not that we trust that just counting on them, we will get a solution. I mean, we have, for example, a manual, a strategic litigation manual. And when you read that, of course, international organizations are important, but if you analyze all the factors that we have to, or the actions that we have to do in order to get, for example, someone released of the political prison, the international organization will be off 100%, will be about 5% of all the factors. And this is important because, first of all, I want to say, I'm talking about the international organizations. I'm not talking about international attention. This is different. Raising international attention is extremely important. I want to clear this up, that it is extremely important to have, for example, your attention. It is important to have this conversation. It's important that all the people that are participating in this conversation, they know that whatever they do, even a Twitter message, even a denounce that we do internationally, a comment about what is going on in Venezuela, even if they know, if they refer to a political prisoner in China or Venezuela, this is important because these governments, these regimes, take care of what the international community say. This is important. However, are the international organizations actually acting the same way as the people wants? I believe that sometimes a Twitter campaign, for example, can be more effective to get the release of someone when in the international community participated in the Twitter campaign than, for example, going to the working group on arbitrary detention, the United Nations working group on arbitrary detention that we go every day. They take so long to respond. They don't have to, and they say it, they don't have much resources and people that can work on that. Is the International Criminal Court, for example, working efficiently and in crimes against humanity happening in Venezuela and China and Russia and all many countries? Well, you may know that maybe this is not the true. Maybe they could be effective, but they are not as fast as they should be. I believe, and I conclude with that this phrase or this sentence that people always use, justice takes long, and this is something that we have to take out of our mind. We have to, as human rights activists, we have to fight, and people that believe in this, in human rights, we have to fight against that. I mean, justice cannot take long. I mean, justice doesn't mean just a criminal proceeding. It means justice in general. It means opinions. It means raising attention about what's going on. It means not to forgive or not to fight against oblivion of what is going on, to fight against impunity, to undermine, I would say, justice because of a political negotiation, for example. And this is something that I believe we need to fight for. I also agree with what Nathan said, that of course all democratic countries should work together, should unite, must unite. All human rights defenders around the world, even from the right or from the left, because I don't believe that I'm the rightist or leftist. I'm just work for human rights, and I don't care about this kind of ideology. We have to fight together against impunity and for justice and for the respect of human rights.
If I may, I think it's a very good question. I think for international community and international organizations, they play a huge role in part of our democracy movement. But the problem is that the international community has failed to stand with people of Burma for many years. I mean, just a recent example is the 2017 when the genocide of the Rohingya, which is the Muslim population living in western part of Burma. When that genocide happened, international community didn't do anything. I mean, they did banned a few generals from coming to Europe and the UK and the US, and that was the punishment that they got. And the military staged the coup on 1st of February this year. And since then, human rights violations happened every day. There are more than 7,000 people in jail right now, and more than 1,000 people have been killed. That's only in the city areas. But, you know, in the beginning, when we received the statement from organizations like the UN and other organizations, we were encouraged to see those. Oh, they were standing up with us and they were concerned about the situation in Burma, but we were hoping for them to take effective action. And people who were protesting on the ground in Burma, they were holding signs written in English because they want the world to see that, they want the world to take action. But now people inside the country lost completely hope in UN, and they are calling it UN stands for United Nothing, because they haven't seen any action coming from these organizations helping people on the ground, because they say, oh, we are risking our lives, we are prepared to sacrifice everything because we don't want to live under another military dictatorship, we don't want to have the military continue abusing power and continue committing human rights abuses with sense of impunity. So in our case, international community has failed us, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything that they can do to help. There are so many human rights organizations focusing on Burma, asking these entities to take effective actions. We have pointed out what they can do to help people in the country, but the problem is the response has been frustratingly slow. But that means it's our job to keep pushing. Sometimes it feels like banging the head against the wall, but it's also our job to hold these organizations accountable and push them, because we know there are things they can do to help people on the ground, and they have to do it. So as a human rights activist, it's hard, but it's our job to keep doing it and make sure that we have the internal pressure and external pressure, and we achieve the change that we want to see. So I like to be hopeful and optimistic about it.
Well, hopefully some members of these organizations are watching today and listening to your voices, because and I hope they're getting the same chills that I'm getting when I hear you all speak about this. Just the fight against oblivion that Alfredo mentioned was really, I think, a powerful statement, and the need to focus on pushing and fighting for today. And I think I heard from a lot of you talking about the time delay and how long everything takes, and the need to keep everything in the immediate forefront of people's minds. Speaking of institutions, we often talk about the critical importance of institutions within democracies as well, right? So I'd love it if each of you could talk about some of the tactics that have been used to weaken the institutions inside your own countries, and how you're fighting to kind of counteract that. Alfredo, you in particular, you wrote a book on the strategy behind autocratic regimes. So I wonder if you want to start on this one, on some of the tactics that authoritarian regimes are using, that the Maduro regime is using in your country to kind of dismantle and co-opt the institutions of democracy.
Yes, well, thank you for that question, because actually what I believe, this is talking about the strategy, the new strategy of these dictatorial regimes is actually to use the judicial system as a facade in order to show the international community that, for example, when a political prisoner is being incarcerated, or when somebody that is protesting or demonstrating is incarcerated, he's not, or she's not someone that is demonstrating democratically and defending his or her human rights. It's because it's someone that is a terrorist or is a criminal, and they use the judicial system, these institutions, in order to send the world a message, or to tell the world, to tell the international organizations that actually what they're doing is justice, that they don't have responsibility of what this independent judge did against this specific person. And this is not the truth. I work every day with the courts and with all these kind of issues, and I'm totally sure that nobody's independent here. And the judges take a decision to incarcerate someone on pretrial detention for years, without conviction, just because they wait for someone to call them and tell what to do. And this is very important, because I still, after many years looking at the same thing and denouncing the same thing, some people in the international community, or some diplomats, just to call it that way, still believing or presenting this situation as an excuse not to get involved in, for example, on a political prisoner is in jail or is suffering of torture or whatever. And this is, I think, extremely important. Look, and of course, this is a very long discussion, but I believe there is something that, for example, in Venezuela, the government has succeeded, and I'm sure it happened because I know the situation in Cuba and in Nicaragua, for example, and a little bit in Russia and maybe China, but they actually the diplomats play the same game. For example, with the political prisoners. Political prisoners are in jail and they become hostages. They become bargaining chips for political reasons. And they use, as I said in my book, as you referred to, and thank you to refer to that big paper, they use the political prisoners in order to get some benefits from the international community. They use political prisoners, they use this game, what I call the revolving door effect. So they incarcerate, they release and they free people, and they then imprison others in order to use these people as bargaining chips. So you will see the same situation happening in China, Cuba, Russia, Nicaragua. So whenever diplomats come to negotiate and try to solve the problem politically in Venezuela, they will always use the political prisoners in order to say, okay, I will release them. And this is a gesture in order to tell the world that, I'm doing the right thing. And this word, I don't know if you guys that are working also in human rights, you have heard this word many times. I've heard from diplomats this word many times, a gesture. And they ask me, Alfredo, what do you think is a good gesture of the government if they release people? 40 political prisoners, 100, 110. And I always say, right now in Venezuela, there are 269 political prisoners and more than 9,000 people that were released, but they're still with restrictions of the freedom. And I always say, come on, how you will ask me about a gesture? You have to release everyone. How you will negotiate with a government that is using the same game all the time, and when they release some, they will get some kind of good I don't know if it's the word, but message from the world that they're doing the right thing, and they do incarcerate the same ones the next week. The same amount of people that they release. And this is a really something that is happening. So institutions, again, are a good facade, and it's not like before in the past that dictatorial regimes are just doing things without protecting themselves by the rule of law, their own rule of law that they always use to excuse or to justify their repression or political repression.
Yeah, maybe I can jump into talking about how, like, not internally, and how these authoritarian regime externally, that they try to even persecute or do anything to stop us from voicing and getting support from the international community. And I think this is a big problem, especially from what the Chinese government has been doing on me and on other Hong Kong diasporic communities and activists. They have several things that they are very good at and used to use. Like, for example, stigmatization. They always claim Hong Kong protests are US instigated. They always claim activists are US trained CIA agents, and they have a lot of like connection with the foreign government, so that they do things like this in order to discredit us, and also make sure that we are depicted as someone who has evil intention and to destroy China because of the guidance of other, like, quote unquote malign foreign forces. This is very common, and I personally have been like stigmatized, facing a lot of stigmatization campaign from mainland China, and some are even talked the most heated topics in Weibo, which is the Facebook and Twitter in mainland China, that, well, the whole propaganda machine was talking about false information in order to discredit you. And the second would definitely be using the economic and political power to deplatform you. I've attended university talks that some of the alumni association of the university wrote a letter to the organizer saying that if they continue to have that talk with me, the China relationship with that university will be damaged. They lay it out very vividly. And there are also some I didn't attend. They canceled the invitation because they said that investor or sponsors have connection with China, have pulled off some of their members in mainland China when they heard that I was going to participate. They were pissed off, and they tried to do things to threaten to cancel their supports. These things happen, and it really gives a lot of pressure to organizations and institutions that were like trying to provide a platform for human rights activists to have a voice, but they are being threatened in that way. But of course, I think these things, it is not only to institutions, but also to governments. I can also sense that there are certain elements, even in the current administration, in the US administration, that they are worried that, like, meeting with me or people like me may worsen the relationship, or that, like, displaying certain heated image of the administration to the Chinese government. And they, as what I was like told by some of the analysts, some of the people around, that they have a tendency to avoid getting in contact with activists like me and like the others. I think this should be changed. Even though, like, we've been talking about how incapable the international community, the international organization to hold the authoritarian regime accountable. But at least the very least that we could do is we have a platform for us to promote our causes, our narrative, and counter those narratives from these malign regimes that abuse human rights violation and use the propaganda and false information to stigmatize everyone. And then we can generate certain forces to make a change, no matter it's on the government level, on the consumer level, on the cultural level. I think at least this is what the international community could do in that way, but seemingly they're not doing enough. And sometimes that disappoints people when even the government is also reacting to that play from, for example, the Chinese Communist Party, and trying not to provide as much support as they could to overseas activists.
If I may, I think both points made by Nathan and Alfredo is very interesting. There are a lot of similarities happening in Burma as well, especially when it comes to political prisoners. Whenever there is a, international pressure, political prisoners would be the first to be released because they've been used as a token. And again, it's the same term, the revolving door, because the population of political prisoners keep growing. So yesterday and the day before yesterday, there were release of political prisoners. And there were incidents of them being picked up outside prison after being released. It's really heartbreaking. And in terms of institution, but now especially after the coup, the Burmese military try to show the world the appearance of law and order, and there is a legal process happening. So they allow all these political activists in prison to have legal counsel, although they have no privacy to discuss about their case in details, or all of the charges are politically motivated for sure. But they want to show the world that, oh, look, these people are being tried legally and they have lawyers. And some international community really fall for that as well. And in terms of action and everything, sometimes we see that all these governments, powerful governments, prefer to keep the diplomatic or bureaucratic relations with the head of state, or at least with or authoritarian regime, rather than helping people on the ground and helping people and support their cause. And with my case, I remember in terms of institution and how the Burmese military have make us feel as a political activist that is something to be ashamed of. So all these now we have a lot of doctors and teachers and nurses sitting inside prison for taking part in the anti-coup protests in the country. Once they come out, they will lose the license to practice. They won't be able to become teacher or go back to their old job anymore. And they have criminal records, so they will be, it will be impossible for them to find a new job. And that's the same case with my dad. When I was growing up, he is a political prisoner. And I was ashamed going to school, and I was ashamed to tell my friends that my dad was in prison for doing the right thing, standing up for human rights and democracy in my country. But I was ashamed to say that because everyone think, oh, your dad is a bad person because he is in prison. It took me years to realize what he stands up for and what he believes in. So it's like that for many generations. So now it's encouraging for many people inside the country to see that different generations are coming together to protest against the coup, and the resistance is growing every day. And I repeat myself that resistance, the growing resistance, needs to be backed up by the international community. And they fail to do that because they're considering, oh, will this upset the military, or we will be kicked out of the country if we support the legitimate government elected by the Burmese people. So, there are so many things people can do, and we are doing our part, and we want the international community to support us as well as a human rights activist outside and human rights activists inside the country as well.
Franak, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I see that trade of political prisoners is the usual thing in almost every country. What we have to do, we have to raise price for each political prisoner, for each repression. We should make all such regimes toxic to the entire world. And of course, it's much easier if we unite efforts. When the regime will be knowing that for each political prisoner, it will have to pay with real money, with real resources, then it will have it will have good incentive to not do this. And of course, international organizations such as Red Cross and others, which are supposed basically to help political prisoners, to prevent tortures, or to help those who were injured by the regimes, very often serve dictatorial regime. And that's another issue we should raise internationally, how these organizations, including the UN departments and UN institutions, how they really help. So basically we have to make the reassessment of efficiency of each tool created by international organizations. In Belarus, we have right now 815 political prisoners, and more than 2,000 political prisoners who are not recognized as political prisoners. We use classification of the Council of Europe, which means that, for example, people who are not under political articles, they are not recognized as political prisoners. So that's also methodology of recognition of political prisoners must be revised, definitely. And we also see that those who are recognized as political prisoners, they often face more harsher treatment. And many families decide to not be recognized as political prisoners, so they can receive shorter jail term or have better conditions in prison. So that's not very healthy. And also what we faced after Roman Protasevich, the young journalist from Belarus who was kidnapped from the plane flying from Athens to Vilnius, Ryanair flight. He's a good friend of mine, and we basically took the same flight just a week before. And we were actually with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya perhaps the target of this operation. He was tortured. He was blackmailed. He was on the hook. Something happened. And after 3-4 days, he started praising Lukashenko, praising the totalitarian regime, saying, oh, that's democratic forces, they're wrong, they hijacked this plane. And basically, in the beginning, I was very angry that how such, how unethical, they use a hostage in order to discredit opponents. But then I realized that I should not definitely blame Roman for collaborating, because we have to put his life first. And all the things political prisoners and hostages are saying, publicly or not, should not be counted, should not be discussed, and should not be quoted by media. That's the best thing media can do, actually, to not multiply the lies and words of hostages, and definitely to not give tribune to dictators. This is what happened to CNN, which took interview from with Lukashenko a few weeks ago, and gave him actually the space and tribune for multiplying lies and propaganda.
I think that's really helpful for me as someone, who works in the media. I think that that's something that I know I and many of my colleagues in journalism think about a lot. Who are we actually giving platforms to speak, and how are we presenting? On the one hand, we want people to know the facts and what is going on in a situation in a country, but how do we present that in a way that doesn't amplify, lies, propaganda, et cetera? So I think that's a really important point. I know all of you have made some really powerful points on the political prisoner question in particular. I want to move a little bit. Actually, sorry, one second before I do the next question. To the audience, I want to remind you to please, while we're talking, if you have questions, drop them in the Zoom chat. We will go to a Q&A at the end. So as we're talking, if you have questions, please go ahead and drop those in now. So my next question for all of you, the international community, the outside world often focuses on, the leader, one single leader in the country, a strong man, whoever is the person in power. But, I think we've seen many instances, and in particular with, the recent release of the Pandora Papers and, previously, previous releases of these documents, just how corruption really plays into supporting and propping up these individual leaders. And I think, a lot of the people who surround these leaders and maybe aren't, the ones that are in the spotlight, they often help kind of support that regime and help the regime really stay in power. And so, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on how corruption, how patronage networks, things like that in your particular countries have really permeated the system of power, and how you see that as, propping up the system and ways to maybe get it, starting to dismantle that. Whoever wants to take that one. Maybe Franak, if you want to start us on that one.
Someone else, sorry.
Whoever, Alfredo, do you want to weigh in maybe on the corruption side? I know Venezuela has featured prominently in when it comes to Pandora Papers and the Paradise Papers.
Yeah, well, corruption is part of the system. We don't actually study that specifically. It's not something that we have analyzed it profoundly. However, we can see it everywhere. Actually, well, what I always say, whenever you are in some way isolated from the world, because remember that Venezuela is being sanctioned by Venezuela, the state, by the United States and different other states what happened internally is what you see is corruption like everywhere. I mean, you don't know where where the money comes from. You don't understand, for example, how they build buildings, and they invest in different businesses all around the country. What is happening right now, when there is not even a credit from a bank. So, however, this is a matter. I mean, corruption. I will link. Corruption should be linked to the human rights issue. So, actually, there is a project of a judge, also a professor of Harvard, Mark Wolf, of the International Corruption Court, in order to, I would say, to persecute all these kind of things. But again, maybe I'm talking too generally because I don't want to talk about specific issues, because I'm in Venezuela right now. But yeah, the big answer, the answer is that I believe that corruption is, of course, part of the system. Is the day by day issue that you see everywhere. But again, it's something also difficult to talk publicly.
Yes, I don't want anyone to to get yourselves in trouble. That is the last thing we want here. So I absolutely respect that. We're getting short on time here, and I want to get to the Q&A section. So I have one final question before we get to some of the audience questions that I'd love each of you to kind of touch on. And it's a really simple question. Why democracy, right? I think we have seen, I think there are polls that show something like 55% of millennials globally say they're dissatisfied with democracy. What is your pitch to the younger generation on why democracy itself is critical and why it's something worth fighting for? I'd love to hear just from each one of you before we move on.
Thank you. Because why not? Now we are having this panel is really encouraging to have this discussion and talk about our, human challenges that we have in our line of work very openly without facing any consequences. I don't have to fear that police will break into my home now and arrest me. That's the part of the human rights. That's the part of the democratic values, and that's what we are fighting for. And because otherwise, we are talking about China, Venezuela, all these countries have similarities of repression going on. People are being arrested for standing up for their rights. People are being arrested and tortured for speaking about truth. So I think democratic value is very important. And in Burma, because we have a lot of diversity, ethnicities in the country, so people are not calling for simple democracy anymore. People are calling for federal democracy with proper, genuine, federalism. So it's a very encouraging step for us to move forward. And if we don't have any democracy, or I know, in Western countries, is not a perfect democracy either. There are so many challenges, but at least we are able to go out freely, and we are able to converse freely about what we believe in. So I think these values are very important, and I know it's a work in progress in Western countries as well, and it's part of our job and individual duties to uphold these values and hold them leaders accountable if they stray from the path as well. So that's what I believe in.
Yeah, maybe I could jump into it. I believe democracy is definitely more than a system. It's more than an election. It's more than votes. It's about how we live our life and how we have a system that could respect everyone's choice, promote diversity, promote basic respect to everyone. So I think sometimes, yes, indeed, well, in democracy, we may make mistakes. We may have election results that may damage the democratic values in its essence. but this is definitely the learning process that we have to adopt. At the end of the day, democracy is the protection of our other important aspects, like rule of law, like basic human rights, like freedom. In Hong Kong's case, you could really see that a city once so free, but without the protection of democracy, without holding the government accountable, your freedom and your rule of law could be lost in just 1 year, in just a glimpse. So I think this is what democracy is important, it is about, and that's why we have to protect that as a system and as a value.
I can just add to previous speakers that democratic countries are usually prosperous as well. So democracy brings many other things, but also it's very important that democracy goes together, must go together with independence. For countries like Belarus, it's super important. Sometimes we are given the choice, like you should decide or democracy or independence. In our case, the propaganda says, if you'll be democratic, you will become part of Russia, or you will have dictatorship but independent state. And this is the false dilemma. And I think in many countries around the world, such dilemma exists. We should not support it. We should break this dilemma. It's fake. It's false. We can get both, and sovereignty and freedom. Democracy is also something that must be learned. We see that countries with many years of non-democratic regime, for them it takes much longer to build sustainable democracies. And those who have democratic traditions since Middle Ages, for example, for them it could be much easier to get back to this. So democracy must be learned. It must be something that everyone must enjoy. Somehow perception. Democracy is the choice. We must provide this choice to everyone. And I think the dictatorial regimes, it's not a choice sometimes. It's just a given situation, circumstance, when many people don't want to live. Democracy, it's like, in most countries, it's a conscious choice.
And Alfredo?
Well, I agree with all what my colleague said. And as Nathan said, democracy is more than just elections. It's more than that. As I said before, these dictatorial regimes also use elections as a way to show the world that they are being democratic. That's why I never, for example, I think, for example, rule of law is not the rule of law from the Americans, from the understanding of the Americans is totally different from my understanding. I mean, rule of law can be used. I mean, they could be the Nazi rule of law, and where laws and judges do things against human rights, and there can be the Russian rule of law, the Venezuelan rule of law, or the government, the rule of law that they use. Rule of law, for example, I believe is more than rule of law as such. It's the democratic rule of law. What is democratic rule of law? And that means the respect of human rights, for example. That means the understanding that elections is not just the only way to show that you are a democratic regime. It's more than that. It's, for example, the independence of the judicial system. As also Walt said, the freedom of a speech, the freedom of walking, on the streets without the fear of being detained because, for example, you talk about the corruption, or you talk about something that's going on in the government. So, I think this is something. It's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to explain. I'm sure we are talking all of us understand what is going on, or you guys understand what is going on in Venezuela, because in Burma is, almost the same thing, or in China, but not many people understands that. I mean, people believe that the democracy is just elections, for example. There is also no thing, look, because sometimes democracy means, what these governments try always to do. They are sustained on three pillars. What I always say is repression, co-optation, and legitimation. And sometimes they control these two very well, co-optation and repression. But what they always fight for, at least to get from the international community, is legitimation. But lately, what I thought, and talking about democracy, that means legitimation, because when you are legitimizing, means that you have elections, and everyone will say that you are legitimized, that you are democratic. But more than that, and what worries me, and taking from what Nathan said, is normalization of, for example, this whole situation. I mean, to normalize that to have political prisoners is something, that is regular in these kind of countries. I remember once, and I will end with this, talking to some Chinese people in the global, in the rule of law. I was part of the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum, and I was part of this rule of law group or whatever. And some Chinese people told me, well, we have our own rule of law. And so we have rule of law. And I said, yes, you have rule of law. You have democratic rule of law. Yes, you have democratic rule of law. And this right now, that China is kind of normalized in this kind of thing. So because everyone is investing, everyone is protecting their money, so then nobody cares about political prisoners anymore. At least from this part of the world, nobody really cares about what is going. Well, I care, but it's not something that people actually know, that there are still political prisoners in China. What they care is how they can get money from China, how they can import things, and of course how COVID is affecting or is originated in China, whatever. But nobody actually talks about political prisoners anymore. Why? Because Chinese are being the experts of normalizing these human rights abuses, and they have taught that to the Cubans, that right now the very good experts of normalizing, for example, the existence of political prisoners and human rights abuses.
Well, thank you all for those really powerful answers. I think, one of the things that tied a lot of your thoughts together that I heard was, not taking democracy for granted, right? Something that you have to continue to fight for, that it's not just the veneer of democracy. It's not just elections. It's not just labeling something rule of law, but actually fighting to make sure that those things are real and are held to account and are able to persist. So, and I think, I thank all of you for contributing that. I want to go, just a reminder, if you have questions, add them in the chat. And we've got a few really great questions, so I'm going to take a look at those. One question from Bernard Lucas for Wei Min in particular, talking about how the United Nations, didn't respond, didn't take action before, after the military coup, et cetera. And I wanted to go, there's another question related to that, talking about R2P. I think, we talk about that responsibility to protect, the idea that, taking international intervention, whether it's military intervention, humanitarian intervention, what do we think about that in terms of, why, if you think right in the 90s in particular, with the Balkans, the responsibility to protect really became this doctrine, right, of arguing for military intervention. And I think we saw, kind of backlash to that. And I think that, the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have also kind of really dampened enthusiasm for international intervention. So I'd love your thoughts, maybe Wei Min, if you want to start on the role of responsibility to protect and the way you all think about that and international intervention. Is it something that you in particular would like to see more active intervention by countries, or, whether it's the international community or specific country, or how are you thinking about the kind of intervention piece of all of this?
R2P is a very interesting question. When the protest started in February and March, a lot of people on the ground were calling for R2P. They really wanted military from the US or even the UN peacekeeping force to come and, intervene and help people on the ground. But my opinion is that R2P and also international intervention, it's at least military intervention, is an out-of-date mechanism. I don't think it can happen today. And also there is no political interest to go and invade Burma, or not invade, I mean military intervention in Burma. So, and oftentimes what we try and ask for R2P, we've tried that in the past, in 2008, when the Cyclone Nargis happened, because the military blocked the humanitarian aid to people in the country. So we proposed R2P. And again, in 2017, when the genocide of the Rohingya happened, there was a proposal for R2P as well. But the problem is China and Russia will always veto it. And also, even the countries support the R2P, it doesn't mean a military intervention. It can mean statements or concerns, the same things that we've been having from the international community. And oftentimes what we have is that whenever we talk about R2P, we just talk about and argue about what should be in the R2P and what kind of things should be included, rather than actually taking action and rather than actually focusing on what they can actually do to help, where we end up spending so many hours, so many days arguing about, oh, this is not the right thing for R2P, this is the right thing. So we don't want that distraction. And in terms of, the simple thing, if, R2P, let's forget about that. Simple thing the international community can do is arms embargo. Around 150 countries in the world don't have arms embargo on Burma. I mean, despite the fact that military has been breaking international law for decades, they're still able to buy weapons from abroad. I mean, these simple things can be stopped. I mean, we don't need UNSC. Countries can do it unilaterally, but they're not doing that. And things like sanctions and things like holding the military accountable, these things can happen outside of the R2P. R2P is an outdated mechanism, and we should be focusing on effective action. And we are pushing the governments around the world to actually get on with it and take effective actions against the military.
On that note, there's another question that's kind of related to the international organization question. This comes from Aurelio Urigoyen. I apologize if I completely butchered your last name, but Aurelio has this question. There's a political global trend to eliminate funding for international organizations. You all mentioned, as we talked earlier, that these organizations like the UN and other kind of multilateral organizations have not been up to the task. But Aurelio says, yes, they're maybe not working as they should be, but eliminating them would probably be worse. So what actions in particular do you think these kinds of organizations like the UN, like the Council of Europe, like the OSCE, et cetera, what actions should they specifically be taking to be better and more impactful on the issue of human rights?
Yes, this is a very good, I say, question, because funding is actually what moves, I believe, these kind of organizations. And maybe I'm wrong. I'm just speaking on, myself or what I think. But I believe, for example, Franak said something about the Red Cross. that is not a public international organization, but depends on many funding. And I, for example, extremely frustrated about the Red Cross in Venezuela. They are here in Venezuela. You see cars all around Venezuela, beautiful cars, you see people, and they don't even receive us at their offices because they feel that they receive the civil society, like an NGO like Foro Penal, which is an NGO that represents political prisoners, are sick, that are in jail, that needs their attention. Maybe the government wouldn't like that. I have sent many letters, and it's something that I said, but it's public, to the representative of the Red Cross in Venezuela. He doesn't even respond, and he doesn't want to receive us. And they depend on funding of what I want to say. Just this is an example, and I will extend a little bit the example because it's important. For example, there is a political prisoner. Her name is very difficult, Emirlendris Benitez. She's for more than 3 years in prison on pretrial detention without conviction, it means. She was tortured. She denounced that she was beaten that way, that she was forced an abortion when she was in custody. And she's sick. She cannot even walk at this point because of what she said happened to her. But anyway, she had a very important health issues. And I don't see the Red Cross there anytime. And I kind of impressed about it, surprised about it. But again, they depend on funding of, for example, governments. So international, that's the point. International organizations depend on funding from governments. That's why it's important that governments that believe in democracy and human rights are the ones that have to put pressure on these international organizations to do, not to be comfortable. I'm not talking about everyone, because I know I have very good friends and I that are fighting and they're part of the UN, and I don't put everyone in the same group, but that are working very hard, and we work very close with the UN representatives of the High Commission of Human Rights here in Venezuela, and we talk to them all the time, and they have helped us in different things. But there are others that not work very efficiently, and I think that's something that we civil society should do, and the governments, democratic governments, united, as Nathan said, should also put pressure on these international organizations to do the right thing, and also to the Red Cross to do the right thing. It's not, if nobody say anything, and we just from here, from Venezuela, saying that, but if nobody help us saying that specifically to that organizations, when they act wrong, or when they don't do whatever they have to do, they will be comfortable doing what they're doing because nobody is telling anything. I saw, and also governments are providing funding to them.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing you say in particular, in addition to the funding, is, some of these organizations that try to act with neutrality maybe end up, doing more harm because they're, too afraid to help anyone who might be, have a whiff of being political or involved in politics, and maybe pushing them to be a little bit more active in that space. Franak, you had a comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in addition to what Alfredo has mentioned, international organizations, they must remember they must serve people, not governments. Because very often, especially in countries with disputed government, with disputed legitimacy, international organizations always prefer to work with those who are de facto in place. And sometimes it helps, but in most cases it doesn't, because it eliminates the representation of civil society, of people of majority, often suppressed by dictators. Dictators in most cases are in minority. And in case if we will be able to redesign international organizations to make sure that they serve the needs of people, societies, but not governments. It will help. To give you an example, OSCE, and right now, since Lukashenko is not recognized by majority of EU countries and OSCE members, on one hand, he doesn't have legitimacy. On the other hand, there is OSCE organization which still invites representative of Lukashenko because he is included as the government in the OSCE. And they don't put much effort to change it, to change this paradox. And the second thing that can be changed, that's the rule, the rule of voting. Right now, in most cases, there is consensus-based. It's a different organization. Interpol, ICAO, right now we are dealing with this Ryanair hijacking, and ICAO, it's a civil aviation organization. They can't punish Lukashenko because there is consensus-based decision-making process, same as UN Security Council. And I think we are in the situation when always there is one country which will abuse this organization. So it can be consensus -1, consensus -2, or just simple majority in order to take decisions. So others, so some countries, some outliers will not be able to manipulate the results.
Winin or Nathan, either of you want to weigh in on this one?
Well, I think there are lots of discussion on well, whether we should defund, whether we should reform. And I think the core is what we can do with that kind of resources, and do we have better option of it? I think the input from international community to human rights work should be increasing. But do we really have an effective platform for now? Or we should establish another one, or we should reform this one. So I think sometimes when people say, oh, defund, it means, seemingly it means that you just pull off that money and go back into your pocket and then just go away. I don't think that is a constructive discussion. What we should think of is how we can have an effective mechanism. It could mean that democratic countries setting up their own alliance in terms of pushing forward policies with the mass of their economy, with the mass of their cultural and political work, and to support overseas activists to gain cultural and social influence. These are possible options that we can utilize the resources that we have, and to explore what avenues we could help. One of the key factors of us having activism, especially international advocacy work, is for the international audience, including people living in democracy, to understand how fragile democracy is and how we should not take it for granted. And we do it by telling stories of political prisoners, stories of ourselves, stories of our country and our city. And that requires a lot of cultural resources and social influence to achieve our goal. So I think there are lots of potential avenues that we could go for. It is not necessarily like the old policy and political making process that we imagine. Actually, there are a lot of ways that we could really promote stories to increase awareness and to make sure that our voice are being heard. This is also people campaigning on international level, that what we can really make an impact. And that is why a lot of authoritarian countries are trying so hard to deplatform all of us, and to try to use economic coercion and intimidate anyone who invited us and provide platform to us, to say that you should not talk to him, you should not talk to her. And that is another way that we could think of this question.
Well, I think the Carnegie Council is certainly not intimidated and is very happy to talk about these issues. And I want to thank you all for sharing those stories with us today. Joel, did you want to say a few words in conclusion?
Well, thank you. I want to thank you, Jen, and thank all the panelists. And Nathan, you that was just an amazing summary, wonderfully said, quite eloquent. Our organization is all about ethics in international affairs. And as I said at the beginning, you all embody that in your work and in your lives. And we admire that. And we are really proud to provide this platform for you. We hope that you, the panelists, and of course, all the people who joined the call, we hope you benefited from this exchange. This is really, it's important for all of us to form a community, to be talking to one another, to be sharing ideas and sharing experiences and to take them into our lives. And so I just want to thank you for coming into our lives today and to assure you that I think Frank said before, it's never over, right? This is just a moment in time. We think of this as a continuum in the best possible way. So I hope we'll see you at some point in person, perhaps in New York or someplace nearer to you. And welcome to the Carnegie Council community. And while we're going to adjourn this session now, we hope this is just the beginning of a longer conversation. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe.
Great.